Well, good afternoon. I've been given the green light by Mr. Abbey to go ahead. So we have an excellent panel on future analogs. And I'll keep my remarks short because there's a wonderful panel members and we only have a limited amount of time. So as everyone knows, analogs have played an important role throughout the history of human spaceflight. They're useful in many ways, and I'll just name a few of them, but the list is very long. So for engineering design, testing and evaluation of scientific and technical systems, refining human-machine interfaces that we just talked a little bit about, training of crews, developing protocols for nominal and off-nominal events, integrating tasks, including operational, research, medical, and other considerations, and enhancing efficiencies and performance. This panel looks at the desired characteristics of analogs and also ways forward how to build on the successes of analogs such as Mars 500 and also utilizing the International Space Station as an analog for exploration beyond low Earth orbit. So having made those remarks, Christian, if you'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that lovely lunch. And it's a great pleasure to be here today as part of this STEAM panel. And here with us today is Dr. Matthias Basner from NSBRI, Dr. Vadim Gushin from IBMP, Dr. Inessa Kozlevskaya from IBMP, Dr. Shikai Mukai from JAXA, JAXA astronaut, and Dr. Albert Nechev, IBMP. Unfortunately, Dr. Yushikov has had to leave for the airport, and Dr. Jean-Marc Comtois, Pascal Lee, and Mark Reagan send their regrets they couldn't be here today. So just a few comments before we get started. I think we're really embarking on a new and exciting phase in human spaceflight and planning long-duration missions to near-Earth asteroids, Mars, and its moons. And these missions will pose historic challenges in duration, isolation, autonomy. We've talked about delayed communications. And analogs really represent a scientific and a cost-effective opportunity to buy down the risk inherent in these missions. And they allow us to simulate, for example, the physical factors of long-duration space flight, isolation, sensory deprivation, the terrain fidelity of a terrestrial surface, and at times the inherent level of danger or lack of danger. Mission characteristics, including duration, task relevance, the level of autonomy. We've talked a fair bit about autonomy. Communications, delayed communications, for example, and long-duration space flight, and workload, operational timelines. Many of us are interested in the human resource aspect of long-duration flight, leadership, crew size, crew composition, and there are a lot of factors in crew composition, specialization of the crew, so tasking, gender, personality factors, and those all play into the cohesion of the crew. In medical care, I would lump under human resources as well. And the last one, station characteristics, and this is a popular topic right now. You know, HEFT has a design team looking at habitability and the size of a long-duration vehicle, the volume. So other characteristics under station would include level of confinement, and with that goes social deprivation. Imagine being with the same 5 individuals for 30 months, locked in a small VW camper. Habitable volume, we mentioned, quality of living conditions, personal space. It'd be very important to have personal space, and I'm sure the Mars 500 people could share a lot with you in that regard. Internal lighting, NASA's been dealing quite a bit with that, and the lighting on station and rest and recreation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our panelists and ask each of them to share with you their thoughts on the role of analogs in future long duration missions. And we'll try and keep our comments to 4 or 5 minutes per person, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some audience discussion and interaction. Matthias, take it away.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'll try to keep it short. I was one of the investigators in the Mars 520 project, and I think we need to congratulate the Russians again for setting up this high-fidelity Mars mission simulation, for allowing international colleagues to participate in that simulation. Now, my primary interest is in crew behavior and performance, and I'm going to look at the analogs from that standpoint. There are at least two things, very important things we learned from Mars 520 with our study. First, there are systematic changes in crew behavior across the mission. That's something we could definitely see. But second, there are inter-individual differences in behavior, and those can be substantial. That means that individual subjects will not follow the general trend, and of course that has possible consequences for crew performance and mission success. Just to give you one example, what we saw in Mars 520 is that overall the crew increased sleep time during the mission and improved their cognitive performance. But there was one crew member who did the opposite thing, who slept shorter and shorter throughout the mission, who actually showed signs that were compatible with chronic partial sleep deprivation. And you can imagine if this is combined with a special emergency situation, that can very well hamper with mission success. So I think we need to be able to predict who will be vulnerable to develop these inadequate coping strategies, to prolonged periods of confinement and isolation. And this will then inform both crew selection and countermeasures, but also the design of spacecraft that we will use to go to Mars. And I think to learn more about this, especially about the inter-individual differences, we need to perform more studies and more simulations. We should not believe that this one long-term 520-day study will be enough to inform all these different things. We probably should use different space analogs for this, with all the different strengths and weaknesses. And probably not all of these studies need to be as long as the Mars 500 study, because what we saw in Mars 520 is that some behaviors developed pretty late during the mission, but many others manifested very early during the mission, so you could see that very early. So some of the missions could be shorter, some of the simulations. I think we also need to start designing the spacecraft for a possible mission to Mars and perform Earth-based studies in these spacecrafts and to try to optimize the design of these spacecraft in a stepwise manner. Now, if you ask me whether we should use ISS as an analog for long-duration pre-flight, spaceflight, I think if we continue to restrict ourselves to Earth-based analogs, there will always be this open question how microgravity would have affected our findings. And microgravity may be very important for some of the outcomes. It may not matter at all for other outcomes. But in my view, as long as we have access to ISS as a test bed for this, we better use it for learning about the effects of long-duration spaceflight. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. Dr. Gushin.
Yes, this is the problem, that our simulation is not a real thing. Doesn't mean that it's fake. But if you listen to those who are working under the guidance of mission control people, they say, no, 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 it's not a real thing. It's uncomparable. This is absolutely different. And they're correct. We do not have at least two things, and not only microgravity. We cannot, during analog, we cannot simulate threat to life. And this is the ethical constraint. So if we do the analog study with human participation, it never can be like in space. And this is even from the psychological point, at least, it's more important factor than microgravity. Threat to life cannot be simulated. But let me speak now about the advantages and what the advantages we have. It was a session previously devoted to the reasons why There is some decrement of vision and some other problems with brain blood circulation. If we if we try to remind what factors were mentioned by Dr. Bogomolov, they were resistant training and some combination of magnetic fields. Why not to do it on Earth? Why not to try to simulate this combination of factors and see if it can be the reason for the decrement of vision? So any problems that we're testing in the analogs must come from space practice. And from that point, it's a perfect opportunity to analyze and to find out, because you never in space will have that amount of logistics, equipment, and devices that we have in analogs. Never in space you will have that combination of scientific groups working together. Biochemists, immune people, people doing the physiological studies, doing psychology. So you can look at the event from different viewpoints, and you never have this opportunity in space. And from that point, again, it's not just the invention of the lazy brain, all that analog studies. It's not because we want to do something easily. It's because we want to understand mechanisms, using all the scientific potential we have here on Earth for the analysis of something that occurred in space. From that point, let me speak a little bit about the chambers of IBMP. What's good about that? It's good that we have different volume, and that gives us, for example, the answer to the question, potentially, how the particular volume could influence crew behavior, crew psychophysiological status, crew cooperation. Today you heard about the existing problems on ISS, that the crew of 6 does not have enough space now. Why not to analyze this in analogs and see how the particular volume is influencing? How much this invisible border between different blocks or segments could influence the interaction? Why not to analyze the decrement of, let's say, trust between mission controllers? Of course, now it's like a dream to believe that we can train mission controllers, but in space analogs, in IBMP, you can train personnel. You can train mission controllers and see how that could influence the interaction with the crew, if it could be more effective from that point. Speaking about cross-cultural training, it also can be used first in analogs and see how it could be effective or not, and if we can take different combinations of subjects, now from China, maybe next time from Japan or some other countries, and we'll see how this crew could work. Moreover, now we do not have the opportunity to test if the crew can work good as a crew. Why not to test them in an analog first and see if they can deal in the chamber under confinement and do operations which are planned to do in space under mission control. So the IBMP chambers give you a unique opportunity to have mission control and crew working together, working under different volumes, working under absolutely controlled situation. I mean, all the parameters of the environment are controlled. All the factors are controlled. You can choose the nutrition you want. You can choose atmosphere you want. You can even change the magnetic environment inside the chamber. And everything is under the control. And nobody will tell you, no, 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 you can't deliver this logistics inside because it's too money consuming. Or this equipment will not work in space. If it works, it can be used in the chambers. So, to sum up, what I want to say, what Mars 500 is all about. It's a perfect experience how we can do cooperation, not in space, but first on Earth, and it provides us establishing good relationship between scientists, between managers, and this relationship is stable. It can work then for space flight. We can choose reliable partners in that kind of studies. We can create and build not only space crews, but research teams for the future space flight. And again, this is a perfect training area, playground that will allow us to play the teams which will work in space effectively. So I think that from that point of view, not only the studies for space can be made under that analogs. For example, now in DLR, they are building their own facility with the chambers. And the main target of their research will not be space. They want the absolutely controlled environment. So any new parameter can be precisely and complexly investigated, and then gives us a real scientifically pure understanding. That's due to this, not to the unknown combination of factors like what we have now in space. Inessa Benediktovna is telling you all the time that comparison of the training schedules made in space does not give us understanding what is better. To understand in reality what is more effective, only analogs can give the answer, because only in analogs you can get the statistics which is really convincing for the scientific community. That's another advantage. You will never get the statistics in space, especially now when all the segments are separated and each country is doing research only on their own astronauts. So you can imagine how much time it will take to get statistics which will be convincing from that point, but not in analogs. And finally, there are almost no political constraints in analogs. We can cooperate and there are no restrictions, maybe not yet. I understand there are people here who are now thinking and inventing that restrictions. But I see now analogs as, again, as a perfect playground for science. And again, we are not inventing these games. The analyzing factors, they are coming from space experience. So let's try to collaborate, at least in the analog studies. And IBMP confirmed by Mars 500 not only its scientific potential, not only the potential of logistics, but the potential to collaborate with you, to provide you scientists, you managers, with hospitable attitude and friendly opportunity to do what you want in the reasonable way and to help you to do the research. And I hope my American partners could confirm this, that they get all the necessary support they required.
Thanks, Vadim. I think we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much for those insightful comments.
That's it.
Dr. Kovleskaya.
Я бы хотела, уважаемые мои коллеги, просто рассказать коротко о том опыте, который имеется в России, ну и в частности, в наибольшей мере в МБП, который в течение многих лет является институтом, возглавляющим исследования в области разработки средств и методов медицинской поддержки космических полетов. Надо сказать, самый главный принцип. We have
to tell you that our primary principle is such that not one asset, not one capability gets sent on orbit without getting thoroughly worked through, and that's the principle that stands regardless of what's happening in the country politically. So these analog-based studies is the filter that everything gets pushed through before it gets sent on orbit. We understand at the same time that there's no such analog system that would be able to replicate 100% all of the human body changes in all the systems. There's no such analog that's been designed yet. However, there are analogs out there that have been used widely and extensively, that have been, I would say, standardized very well. Their impacts, their time and amplitude impacts have been studied and examined thoroughly, and these analogs for long-term flight support have proven to be a bed rest study, hypokinetic study, and with respect to short-term flights, starting in 1973, immersion has been such an analog, the immersion study. A third, but not least, type of analogs is animal-based studies. You may find it hard to believe, but my department that deals with sensory and locomotor aspects, we are jacks of all trades. We're specialists in all fields. My people did the year-long bed rest study. They do at least 2 immersion studies a year, and then other specialists in my department, they take the same very phenomena that we study and they do animal-based equivalents. They do rat-based studies, which is a great equivalent that reproduces, replicates muscular and nervous system impacts of spaceflight and microgravity, better than any other known model. Using monkeys in our research efforts, our Bion study that's been reviolated, the Bion satellite series studies, same types of questions, hopefully with the same types of techniques, are performed using a variety of animals depending on what the issue appeals to and addresses, i.e. what type of area this particular activity addresses, whether it's cellular level or something much higher, or even beyond that, cognitive and behavioral. In that case, we take apes. Everybody is in flight. We have a new arc, and this new arc is our study research facility. We were dormant in that field for almost 2 decades, talking about highest forms of animals, but as regrettable as that is, that approach still exists, it's still robust, and it's quite promising. Besides, what shows a lot of promise is to have the same sets of impacts and to look at them using different models. And by varying the models that we put the same inputs into, we are able to better describe the models themselves and to prove their validity and robustness. What it is that we study? It's not psychology, of course. What we do target as our areas of study are the gravity impacts, microgravity impacts. Our discoveries are such. Our very basic hypothesis was that we have systems that are gravity dependent, vestibular system. Of course, we'll have vestibular changes as a result of being placed in a zero-G environment, and we'll have all of the effects that will develop as a result of what the vestibular system perceives as a delta in the gravity environment. But it turned out that a huge class of phenomena can be replicated on Earth, where the vestibular system doesn't get impacted whatsoever. And it turned out that same sets of phenomena in the locomotor system and sensory system can be replicated in bed rest, hypokinetic studies, and in immersion. However, the depth and the rate of these changes in the immersion are times higher and deeper, in other words, faster and deeper than at bed rest. Even though in both cases, we're talking about hyperkinetical situation. In other words, no motion, little or no motion, all of that supposedly being equal, but for some reason, some of the changes go like this in the immersion, just like in 0G. For example, the muscular tone reductions take 6 hours. We get to the max value, and the max value is negative 40%. That's quite high. Whereas in bed rest studies, we see the same trend, and it's trending, but it reaches its maximum by day 30, 30. Can you see the difference? 6 hours on the one hand versus 30 days. And the depth varies too. And vestibular system primarily doesn't take any hits. So we started using a different system that instigates muscular tone changes, and we were proving quite successful in that. And successful enough that we came up with new flight countermeasure systems that are being used now that use that muscular tone impact principle. All that I'm saying is, and it goes well beyond just one system. It's quite higher and broader. Using analogs lets us come close to the very mechanisms, the bare bones, what it is that changes once we subtract gravity. So once you start doing that, you can start seeing how one model differs from another, how immersion is different from bed rest. And then it's wave bearings. What I'm trying to say is that nobody is willing to speak about this, because unfortunately, immersion studies worldwide we're the only authority that does that right now. In this current configuration with space application, a 7-day immersion. We have a dry immersion model that's been developed the last 7 days. Those who are the designers of the system, they went all the way up to 56 days, and there was no harm done. Only the effects that were identified were deeper, and animal-based analogs give us great results. And I was really delighted during the Skylab panel to hear that there were 66 analog-based studies, 66 sim studies that were performed before Skylab proceeded. How come we've lost track of that kind of variety, both on your side and our side? I don't believe that's right. I believe that we need to go back to the analogs and start a new era of analogs, joint analogs.
Those comments, thank you. Thank you very much.
And we have to start using the best models we've got.
Dr. Mukai.
Thank you, Christian. And given this opportunity, I would like to give talk 3 points. The first thing is I would like to congratulate the great success on Mars 500. And as Dr. Gushin mentioned, unfortunately, Japan was not participating in this program because we had the budget constraint. But in future, if you folks have this kind of situation, we would like to utilize that situation not only for evaluating the space life science issue, such as BPH, sleep, multicultural issue, etc., but also we would like to utilize this, this kind of occasion for something related to the living things, like a food quality, food quantity, or clothing, including the material, which is bacterial-proof material or something like that, and also the design of the interior so that we can give a very comfortable environment to the crew, and washing machine, if we need to go Mars, we definitely need some washing machine for the clothes or something like that. So that's the one. That anyhow, Japan is also very much interested in utilizing this kind of analog environment. And the second, if I think about the analogs for future, of course, we have a lot of analogs which we have already listed, like ISS. And also the Russian group is trying to ISS to utilize the expansion of the Mars 500. I think Dr. Ushakov mentioned the Mars 500 ISS project is the name. So it's a very promising facility. And then the situation is, since including ISS or Antarctica or bed rest, immersion, many things, we have a lot of facilities spreading all over the world. And one approach is that I think the BPH working group under the ISRUS, International Space Life Science Working Group, is trying to develop some catalogs about these different facilities, list, validation, and also the purpose of the experiments that you can utilize these facilities, and also standardization so that different experiments can compare to the same type of experiment, but using the different facility in all over the world. So the make the catalog and the standardization is a very important to enhance the availability of the analogs environment for researchers who are interested in. That's my second point. And the third one is kind of raising issue for analog environment. Because if we think about the human risk factors caused by space environment, mainly I come up with three things like microgravity, confined environment, and radiation. And the microgravity related to bone muscle issue, confined environment, BPH, psychology, multicultural issue, we will be able to simulate somehow, but not the radiation issue. But the radiation is very, very important if we explore Mars or interplanetary mission. So I think it's very difficult to simulate radiation environment from the viewpoint of immunology or resistance or cancer issue, etc. Maybe right now we have to do is maybe enhance animal research, or maybe need to accumulate the data which is very important data of the space flyers related to this. So the longitudinal study needs to be done for filling this kind of gap that we don't have for the radiation analogs. That's all I have.
Dr. Mackay, thanks so much for those important comments. And so lastly, Dr. Nechayev, I've just asked you to keep your comments brief so that we could have some discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Как всегда, когда
As always, when it's the last panelist's turn to speak, you realize how much importance there is in this subject and how many of the important things you've been planning to discover for everyone has already been mentioned. Well, I'm not going to be discovering America here when I say that there's no doubt about the validity of the experiments for technology, for life support that we achieve via the ISS operations. What are the most important results? What are the most viable and valid results? The results that we get on the ISS, because these are the results we get via the actual real flight, orbital flight. But how technologies, future analog technologies get shipped to the ISS, how they're going to be deployed there. These assets and techniques need to be thoroughly investigated and tried out on Earth. So ground-based analogs is critical, not to be underestimated. needed. And that role is important because this is our chance to take a detailed look and a detailed feel for testing out our theories before cosmonauts and astronauts, also given the tight time constraints that we've got on orbit, on the ISS. So before we hand it over to the crew that's flying, before they get to test out the efficiency of these assets, we need to do our job down here. Plus, using the ground-based analogs expands our capabilities as far as assessing the psychological aspects, psychological and physiological capabilities and constraints of human bodies, the autonomy and how limited groups function in the autonomy environment. And I wanted to tell you, rather remind you, that about a year ago, in April, here in Houston, there was a meeting that took place that was dedicated to the international cooperation in the analog-based systems applications. And it was a real important, real good meeting that lasted 2 or 3 days, and important issues were reviewed there that have to do with increasing international cooperation efficiencies. It was mentioned there at that meeting how important it is to generate catalogs, ground-based analog catalogs that will be describing their features, so that the space flight parameters studies would be, the researcher developing their plans would be able to study the catalogs and find the analog systems that fit their purposes the best. Standardization was talked about to great length, and database and archiving, data archiving. And it was mentioned that that a major constraint as far as international cooperation is just so happens is budget and budget policy, because every country has their own research programs that are receiving their funding from budget, and the ISS is no exception. So one of the conclusions that was generated during that meeting, one of the important findings, rather, was to put together a working group whose purpose would be to try to work out the logistical and technical aspects of increasing international cooperation with respect to using the worldwide body of ground-based analogs. And I've been around the block, as you can see, but I'm thinking that as far as increasing that efficiency, we need to think about creating a international combined database and knowledge base, really. And by accessing that database, a researcher, a potential PI, would be able to assess what it is we know, what it is we don't know, and where it is we need to be heading. But then again, this is creating this kind of a toolkit is something that is not beyond the political realm, and it needs to be resolved, in high offices. I'm not going to be naming any names because everybody knows what we mean. But at least, let's tackle it at the level of space agencies. It needs to start there. This kind of pathway seems the most rational and really ideal, because if we want to walk the walk together, we need to talk the same talk. And last but not least, what seems much more optimistic is a way of creating national databases, uninational databases first, and you'd access those. It would be a warranted access, with some kind of a directive from up top. But we start taking it on a nation-by-nation level, and so a researcher, a future PI, would, when they're setting out on the path towards developing their project design, they would have free access to the data, and based on the data they access, they would be able to start thinking about cooperating and joining their forces. That is all I had.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Nechayev, and for bringing attention actually to the International Analog Working Group. I'd just like to point out that that group is a direct result of this meeting over several years. So with that, we'd like to open it to the floor for questions for our panelists. Sarah.
We often look at other environments to be used as analogs, but I think it's also important that the space environment's considered an analog as well. For example, about a year ago, the Navy contacted our office at NASA headquarters to inquire about women being on submarines. So, of course, we recommended the best of the best, and they've chosen the top tier of their class from the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and the subs have now been integrated. In that regard, I think we could also look at the military as an analog environment for us. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for question, but in the last session, as we're looking at these issues for intracranial pressure, TBI, the military has certainly experienced that. And we didn't have a chance to really look at the human factors in this, but the demographics. What is the age that we're seeing this? What is the gender? And certainly the military has a whole cohort that we could look at. So with that, I have to ask the proverbial questions. Are we going to be very clear about human factors, age, gender? I know we've mentioned race and ethnicity and cultural issues. I think that's going to be very, very important.
A brief comment from the panel on that at all? Brief?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And then any situation can be an analog environment from the viewpoint of the researchers who want to interact. So the military group is one of them, gender group is one of them. So that's why I think, as him also mentioned, the catalog to develop some kind of environment, list all of them that we can think of, and then show the possible researchers the availability of the environment. That's what I think.
Other questions?
Извините, еще небольшой комментарий. Начинаем мы.
A small comment. We are the instigating party, but of course, our go is given from our authority up top. And something else from me. But what I wanted to say, that no matter what analog you grab, it will replicate just one thing, but not the entirety of what you're trying to reproduce. There's no versatile analog out there, and oftentimes our errors stem from us trying to grab an experiment that's already underway and kind of try to fit that glove on the hand that it's not designed for, and try to get the results that the experiment wasn't designed for. So this is harmful rather than useful.
Спасибо за выступление.
Thank you to all the panelists, but I wanted to expand the scope of the discussion, because using the example of that catalog of the analog systems and using the training experiments and the pre-flight experiments need to be probably incorporated into that catalog, because we have the zero-G flights, we have certain types of training activities that are performed and assessed, and these are analogs too. Pre-flight is a source of analogs too, and the flight itself, a space mission in and of itself, should be viewed as analogs of future missions.
Расширяет значительно наши, возможности. Причем в каждом конкретном случае.
And so each increment, each and every increment is special in their own ways. There are special considerations that beg for some conclusions. It's not that we need to make conclusions, but we need to plan their tasks, pre-plan their tasks, and use different flights to resolve different issues. Wonderful. These thoughts are just jumping into our heads as we speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bogomolov. And I think that's a very important point, that each flight is in of itself an analog, if you will, for longer duration flight. And many of the panelists have mentioned ISS as an analog for future long duration space missions. Many of you are probably aware of ISTAR and the efforts to utilize space station as an analog for long duration flight, implementing some autonomous operations, delayed comm, looking at various aspects of long duration flight. I wonder if anyone has any questions or comments in regard to that in the audience. Our panelists.
From that point, I'd like to say that this is the peculiarity of human brain. We'd like to think that many things are similar, but sometimes it's not like that. It's an illusion. I think that speaking about analogs, Still, it's more important not just to make a list what can be analog to analog and what is similar to what, but what is different. What is different. And from that point, each model, as Dr. Kozlovsky, academic Kozlovsky is saying, has its own limitations. Speaking about spaceflight, speaking about submarines, it's all these situations have certain limitations. Limitations to do research, limitations to cooperate, limitations to use logistics. Submarines are good statistics. Army is perfect, millions of people, but what kind of instruments I can use there for the analysis? That's major limitation. And again, it's better to concentrate on what we have. I think we are still underusing and not using properly the opportunities we already have. It's so easy to rotate your head and finding this and this and this. Maybe better to concentrate a little bit on what we have and try to use it better.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? The definition of the analogs that I understand this is if you categorize something as an analog environment, it always have limitations. It's not similar. It's similar to the one that you want to interact, the environment that you want to interact. So the ISS increment can be analog if you want to investigate the Mars or something like that. But it's not the exactly same environment of the Martian days or something like that. So it's still mimicking the situation. So that's why the researcher needs to understand what we can simulate and what we cannot, and then take the advantage of that simulated environment for your research purposes.
Very good point. Larry, you had a question.
Yes, Christian, to return to your question about ISTAR and using the space station as an analog for long-duration exploration missions, let me take just a moment to return to the question of analogs for looking at alternate countermeasures. We heard a lot this morning in the VIP discussion about ARED and so forth. For years, most everybody in this room has heard the same discussion about artificial gravity as a potential countermeasures. The unknown aspects of gravity gradient, large von Braun torus versus small short radius centrifuges. Effective analogs have been carried out looking at it as a countermeasure. They've been done with dry immersion, thanks to Dr. Kozlovskaya and her colleagues at IBMP. They've been done with head-down bed rest tilts, largely in Japan at Nagoya. They've been done with long-duration bed rest studies with my colleague Dr. Pulaski at University of Texas Medical Branch. And the sine qua non of testing the effectiveness of this alternate way of developing a countermeasure must be done with humans in weightlessness. It would be nice to have animals, but we all know where that story has gone. I'd like the comments of the panel, many of whom I've discussed this with, on the appropriateness of trying to do artificial gravity feasibility studies using a short radius human centrifuge on the space station.
Someone like to take a stab at that? Or perhaps someone in the audience?
Briefly, I agree with you. We need that kind of experiment on board. But maybe somebody would.
Just while the microphone's moving around, Larry, as you know.
Larry, I'm sorry, but in this question, I still come to our joint discussion. I'm quite sure that it is very difficult to perform all the necessary experiments, like defining the parameters of stimulations, as we told with you just recently. And I don't believe that we will be able to use it on station with our cosmonaut without being sure that this is that parameters, that characteristic of simulation which we need. So before that, we need to perform very broad experiments on board, selecting all these parameters which we have written together with you, which should be defined, first of all, in standard situation of standard on-ground simulation experiment. And then I'm quite sure we have to repeat, but repeat much. It will be not so expanded, but just, you know, this narrow experiment on station, which will definitely will tell us, yes, this is the mean which we can and we would like to put on the board. Yeah, okay.
Great. I think we're getting into the other panel, but I wonder if we could give maybe just two last questions. Bill Shepard has a question.
One of the things that I observed in a prolonged period of training with the shuttle program was that we would anticipate failures and train the crews before they flew on what engineers and operators would assess were the critical things that could happen. But in reality, in spaceflight, things take place which the cause and effect is not immediately obvious, and in some cases is never known exactly why this event took place, but it's still a problem that the crew has to deal with. This is something that is not experienced well in the training environment, and this is seen as somewhat irrational and inappropriate. But I think it is one of the most important aspects of spaceflight, and I would like the panel's comments on whether this is something that should be present in analog environments. Basically, situations which are not totally rational, but still present challenges for the crew and the ground team to deal with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and this speaks to the ecologic validity that the different analogs have. You need to make it as realistic as possible, and I also couldn't agree more with what has been said before, that there's no perfect analog, but there's also no such thing as zero risks. There will always be a risk remaining, and what I think what we all want to do is we want to minimize the risk for the crew that is eventually traveling to an astronaut or to Mars. I think we already have many pieces of this big puzzle, and I think now we need to identify those missing pieces that are most important so that we can get the whole picture. And I guess microgravity is one of the big pieces in the middle that is still missing. So I would still advocate for using ISS as an important analog for long-duration spaceflight.
Just one quick comment on Bill Shepard's comment was, I think what you're getting at, and coming from an exploration environment background, the exploration environment is not a controlled environment. It's always changing, and yet, you know, are those opportunities being provided to crews where they're, you know, encountering the unexpected, and how do they deal with that?
I'm just saying there are elements of this environment that at the surface are irrational.
Yes.
And we should attempt to create analogs that create it.
I couldn't agree more. Last question to Helen, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to vacate.
То, что зависит от нас, рационально. То, что не зависит, иррационально.
And then I think we'll have to vacate for our next panel. Helen, you've got the last question.
Yeah, I have a comment that you made about doing the simulations in such a way as you could look at the configuration of, say, of a vehicle to Mars, how much cubic space you need, what kinds of engineering support. And I think that's a great idea as we look at long-term trips to places like Mars. And the other piece of that I think we need to look at is the crew configuration. There's a lot of discussion whether that should be a 2, a 4, a 6, or what the age, the skill, the genders, and all of that. And we have really been very little experimentation on that. We had a chance at NASA to do, Johnson Space Center to do a 91-day study, and I was just talking to Joe about the SMEAT test, and also McDonnell Douglas did a 91-day study, and some of those issues came up in those particular studies, as a gender mix, and also there were some differences in age and expectations. And so I think that you could look at the engineering piece of it, I think is great, and we should do that, and also encourage to look at more of the human factors and the dynamics of the space and the mixture of the crew.
Very, very key elements. Well, thank you so much for your participation. That was a big hand of applause for the audience and for our panelists. Thank you.